So I just heard on the news that a local school had a kidnapping yesterday. Everything's all right, though. They ended up waking him up. The only thing worse than that, dad joke, is sleeping on these players who are starting to make a name for themselves in training camp. Hit that like button. Let's talk about some training camp sleepers. Hey, what's going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome back to the Fantasy Headliners. Kyle coming to you from the Draft.com studios. And in this episode, we've got 4 players for you that you should be keeping your eye on here in the preseason. They've started to make a little bit of a name for themselves for different reasons, whether it be performance or injuries or something else. And because of that, you're going to want to keep them on your radar the rest of the preseason. Now, they might not give you tons of fantasy value right away, but they could be in a position later to do that. Before we jump into it, though, don't forget our Fantasy Headliners Draft Guide, only $19.99 at thefantasyheadliners.com. Right now, get yours, almost 500 pages of straight fire fantasy football content. Go and get yours today before your draft, updating it throughout the entire season up until week 1. Without further ado, it's time to talk about some preseason sleepers. All right, the first player that we should be keeping an eye on is Brian Hill from the Atlanta Falcons. And obviously, Devonta Freeman is the running back one there. And recently, the coaching staff has come out and said, Devonta Freeman is our number one. And then basically after that, it's a bunch of guys trying to secure that backup role. Even though I believe in Devonta Freeman this year, I still believe it is in your best interest, especially as an owner of his, to keep his backup on your radar. And right now, Brian Hill seems to be the guy that is in the lead for that backup position. He's throughout the preseason, they've played 2 games so far, the Hall of Fame game and then preseason week 1. He's locking down that backup role, 80 yards on 19 attempts so far this preseason. And the main factor that you're looking at with Quadre Olesen and Ito Smith is how inefficient they have been so far. Now, again, it's only the preseason. We don't want to get too worked up, but Olesen has a yards per carry of 3.1, and Ito Smith has a yards per carry of 1.9. I already mentioned it. The backup to Devonta Freeman could be a very important role because if you are worried about his injuries in any way, shape, or form, or maybe the Falcons look at regulating his workload a little bit more this season, you're going to want to have his backup. Now, Brian Hill, he finished 2018 pretty strong, 145 yards on 16 carries over his final couple of games. And Brian Hill, again, might not have a ton of fantasy football value, especially when you're looking at handcuffs. Because when people ask me, hey, Kyle, what do you think about handcuffs? I said it on our live show last week. There's really 2 different types of handcuffs. Number 1 is going to be the type that if there's an injury or inefficiency, this person could step in and help. The other one would be guys that have standalone value, like a Latavius Murray to Alvin Kamara, that type of a player. With Brian Hill, he's not going to have that standalone value more than likely, but if Freeman starts to see a reduced workload or is injured at any point in time, then yeah, 100%. Brian Hill looks at this point in time to be the best running back on that roster to secure that backup role. He's probably not even being drafted right now, so you can get him at a very, very good ADP, or you can put in a waiver claim for him if you've already drafted. All right, the next name on this list is New England Patriots wide receiver Jacoby Myers. And just to make a quick note, I don't love the word sleeper because are there really any sleepers these days with the infinite amount of materials that we have access to review players? I prefer undervalued players. But with that being said, Jacoby Myers until this past weekend was probably a sleeper, a deep sleeper at that, because had you really heard of him? With him being a sleeper, it's basically because that you just haven't heard his name mentioned that much so far. You have Philip Dorsett there still. Obviously, Julian Edelman is the wide receiver 1. There's been a lot of talk about the tight end position. And then also, on top of that, Josh Gordon applying for reinstatement. A lot of focus has been placed on that. So some of these guys that are buried on the depth chart just haven't seen their name called a lot at this point. We could see Jacoby Myers in the regular season in 3 wide receiver sets. He's probably not going to make too big of an impact or be fantasy viable unless there were to be an injury. But in 3 wide receiver sets, Edelman can move to the slot, and then Harry and Myers could end up playing on the outside. Or if the tight end position just isn't functioning very well, maybe we see the Patriots run some 4 wide receiver sets this year and throw some people off. He's had a big start to the preseason so far, 6 receptions for 69 yards and 2 touchdowns. And just to keep in mind, on playerprofiler.com, the best comparable player to Jacoby Myers right now is Mohamed Sanu, who has been a reliable, fantasy viable wide receiver 3 or flex option in Atlanta recently. So do we believe in Tom Brady just enough to be able to get the ball to people outside of Julian Edelman? Keep in mind also with the New England Patriots, it seems like every single year there's multiple games a season where guys we don't even think about blow up and have a huge game. Maybe Jacoby Myers ends up being one of those guys in a situation where maybe somebody's a little bit banged up. They're going to be playing a defense that just isn't nearly as strong as some others. Jacoby Myers could find himself in the starting lineup and have himself a big day. Put him on your radar. Put him on your watch list. You don't need to go crazy drafting him right now, but he's definitely someone that you need to pay attention to. All right, the final wide receiver for this episode that I have for you is Rashard Higgins from the Cleveland Browns. And trust me, there are plenty of Rashard Higgins truthers out there. So when Antonio Callaway was suspended to start the season, you could hear them high and mighty all over the place. And I don't necessarily blame them. I do think Antonio Callaway is a better talent, but obviously it's been hard to trust him so far. With so many options in Cleveland, can Higgins have any type of a role? He looks lock and loaded to be the wide receiver 3. We just need to see if Baker Mayfield can get him any type of production. So with Antonio Callaway gone out to start the season, that's going to open up the door for Rashard Higgins. And if Higgins can come out and actually produce in any way, shape, or form, Callaway might not find his way back into the lineup right away when he returns. Now, Higgins was extremely undervalued coming out of college because of his workout metrics. They were not great. He didn't test very high in any single area. But the one thing that did show up was that he scored in the 88th percentile for his college dominator rating, and he scored in the 92nd percentile in breakout age. His breakout age actually came at the age of 18 while in college in terms of his production and how much production he had on his team. In the preseason so far, 5 receptions for 98 yards and 1 touchdown. We already mentioned it. Baker Mayfield, can he spread the ball around enough? Yes, he will. Baker Mayfield is going to be the type of quarterback that isn't going to lock in on just one player because he's an extremely good quarterback and a smart quarterback. So he's going to find the open player. So if OBJ has a lot of people looking at him one day, covering him one day, maybe Jarvis Landry is seeing some extra coverage one day, there's a chance every once in a while that Higgins could find himself in a position to have a really nice game. Now, Higgins, for me, is a guy that I'm definitely taking a look at in best ball. In redraft leagues, I'm probably not going to spend a late-round pick on him right now unless there were to be another injury. But keep in mind, we've been saying all offseason long on this channel, we really love the Cleveland Browns. And if we really love the Cleveland Browns and something were to happen to Jarvis Landry, Rashard Higgins is going to have an opportunity to have some decent fantasy value. So keep him on your radar, because if he steps in as the wide receiver 2 at any point in time, then we need to talk about starting him more often. Last but not least on this episode, Dante Hilliard from the Cleveland Browns, sticking in Cleveland for our last sleeper. And Dante Hilliard, you probably didn't hear anything about him until recently. You may not have known who he was, and you might not still know who he is. But he could have a very important role for fantasy football owners this year because, as we've seen in years past, owning a very good running back's backup can be all the difference in a season. Dante Hilliard with Duke Johnson gone, that means he's going to be the primary backup for the first part of the season to Nick Chubb. So if anything were to happen to Chubb in the first part of the season, Hilliard could see a very nice increase in his workload. Now, Chubb's going to get all of the work on the ground. Hilliard doesn't profile as that type of a running back. To me, he profiles more of a guy like a James White, an Austin Eckler, a guy that's going to see work in the passing game and be more effective in the passing game than getting a bunch of rushing attempts on the ground. So that's where we could end up seeing a role for him. Now, I love Nick Chubb in the passing game. Do not get me wrong. I'm not saying that Hilliard is going to be that type of a player right now. Now, could he become that type of a player if there's an injury? Yes, but Chubb is going to see work in the passing game. We already saw it in the preseason. Week 1, he had catches on the first series of the day. Now, so far in the preseason, after one game, Hilliard does have 3 catches for 34 yards, so not a ton to work off there. But again, if anything happens to Chubb, his backup is going to be very, very important in that high-powered offense. The Browns, if they did not believe in their depth chart, I'm sorry, they would not have walked away from Duke Johnson. I know that there was issues with them. I know that he wanted out. I know that they had been trying to trade him. But if they didn't feel confident that they had somebody to take over for Chubb until Hunt were to come back, they probably would have held on to Duke Johnson. So they must trust these players on their depth chart. The one thing about Hilliard that I just want to mention are his workout metrics. He scored in the 87th percentile on the 40-yard dash, and he scored at least the 66th percentile for all of his other workout metrics other than the bench press. And that's why I mentioned Hilliard probably isn't going to be that effective of a running back on the ground. He's going to be more of a pass-catching guy, a guy that's going to get you some yards after the catch, a guy that's going to run some decent routes. He's going to be able to possibly help you if Chubb were to go down. But again, if you own Nick Chubb and you didn't grab Kareem Hunt, maybe spend a very late round pick on Hilliard right now and just hold on to him for a little bit and see what happens. That way, if anything does happen, knock on wood, if anything does happen to Chubb, you're going to have his primary backup for the rest of the season. When Hunt comes back, though, you're probably going to lose all value with Dante Hilliard, and at that point, you'll just end up dumping him the waivers. So you have to decide, are you going to spend a late-round pick on a guy that you're not going to end up keeping all season anyway? That happens from time to time, but that's why we're taking those shots on these players late, and that's why we're considering them sleepers, because as of right now, they're not going to be fantasy viable, but they could be in the near future. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Fantasy Headliners. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. Let us know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we're going to catch you on the next episode. Thanks, everyone.